Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Government Analytics Breakfast Forum. I'm Jennifer Bachner, and I direct the Master of Science in Data Analytics and Policy program at Johns Hopkins University. I want to welcome both our longtime attendees as well as those who may be joining us for the first time. We host this forum to cultivate a community of professionals, scholars, and students who are interested in leveraging analytics to solve challenges in the public sector. We very much encourage your participation during the forum, and you are invited to ask questions after our speaker's presentation. You can also tweet about the event using the hashtag GAB forum, and we'll be posting a recording about 48 hours after the event, and you are encouraged to share it with your colleagues. Thank you again for being here today, and I'll now turn the program over to Jeff Myers at REI Systems, who will introduce our speaker.
Thanks very much, Jen. And I want to echo Jen's remarks in thanking you for joining. The purpose with which Johns Hopkins and REI founded these forums is essentially to create community so that you have a chance to kind of share your successes, to hear lessons learned from other folks, and essentially to kind of make sure that good ideas get used broadly across government to improve government. If you're not familiar with this or some of the other things that we do, REI Systems actually focuses not just on analytics with Johns Hopkins in a partnership. We also have a similar partnership kind of building community around grants with George Washington University. And I'm pleased to announce that after a visit last year, we decided it was important to begin partnering with a historically Black college and university. And we are going to just be starting a similar partnership around government IT with Howard University's College of Engineering. In fact, on April 16th at 2 p.m., we're going to be hosting our first event with both the National Institutes of Health and FDA offering representatives who will discuss using artificial intelligence to detect and help address minority health disparities. So hopefully some of you may be interested in participating in that event as well. It will have a similar 1-hour format with the presentations and questions and answers. Just as a brief bit of background about REI, and this is really all we'll say about it, REI is really dedicated to using technology to help improve and strengthen government's ability to achieve its missions. We're proud, actually, particularly in using analytics on ourselves because we believe the cobbler's children should have shoes. So we found that actually over the past year, despite being on telework and not having a chance to see our clients face-to-face, REI's customer satisfaction has moved up from about 3.5 on a scale of 1 to 5 up to about 4.5. So we think we've done a pretty good job, and we're measuring that to make sure that it's something that we can document. We're also very pleased that we helped one of our clients, the Health Resources and Services Administration, begin making grants just exactly 12 days after the CARES Act was passed, getting grant funding to folks who are providing treatment to victims of COVID faster than any other agency in government. We're also piloting a kind of a before and after analytics approach to app monetization and investments in technology. We recognize that investments in both technology and investments in analytics, it's hard to measure how much value are you getting from them. And it's important to do so, I think, in order to be able to help government make the right judgments about how many staff to hire, and what sorts of analytic efforts to undertake. So with all that as background, let me turn to Shannon Files, our speaker today. And I'll give you briefly first kind of a reason as to why we've invited her to speak. First, if you are not aware, which I suspect few of you are unaware, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is a relatively new agency and kind of unusual in government in being so new. And so they had a blank slate to kind of think about what should analytics look like in terms of technology, in terms of approach and methods, in terms of staffing and kind of everything under the sun. And so we thought it would be exciting to hear from Shannon about kind of starting the new programs at CFPB and some of the reasons behind doing that. The other pieces are something that are not necessarily related to the newness of CFPB, and those are that CFPB really has a mission that is analytics heavy, using analytics to help detect not only individual instances, but trends and behaviors of financial institutions that may be harmful to consumers, and figuring out kind of what can be done about that and evaluating the results of potential actions. Those are all really important parts of what CFPB does, and they rely on analytics. And then last, I think this is something that I feel strongly about personally. CFPB is pretty unusual. My experience is that CFPB gathers data itself, but it also relies heavily on data it acquires from outside sources and mashes it up. And I think that's something that is kind of a little bit of a less charted territory for government analytics. And I think that would be something that will be really interesting to learn and hear a little bit about from Shannon, and perhaps ask questions about kind of how does CFPB do that? How does it choose what data sources to acquire and how much to spend and how it can use them and what kind of licenses it may have. So with all that, let me introduce Ms. Shannon Files, who is the Director of Enterprise Data and Analytics for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. She has a broad experience in the federal sector as a federal employee, as a government contractor, and in the commercial sector. She has worked interested in joining CFPB and who have some expertise in data science and data analytics that they are hiring on a relatively regular basis. So with that, Shannon has asked that you hold your questions generally till the end of her presentation. I encourage you, though, at any point during the presentation, to type your questions into the question box, and we'll try, and if there are three of the same question, we'll group them together. If there's one question and it's particularly compelling, we may unmute you and invite you to ask.
I think Jeff froze, but I'll just, he was just saying that, yeah, feel free to type your questions into the chat and we'll monitor them. And then Ms. Files will answer them after the presentation. So with that, I will turn the program over to you, Ms. Files.
All right, thanks. Thanks for the great introduction. So as Jeff mentioned, I am the Director of Enterprise Data and Analytics at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So this talk is titled Building a Data Organization in a Startup Government Agency. I think it's an interesting perspective on kind of how we built out our data organization, how we built out our tooling based on being like kind of in the midst of the modern data boom, if you will. So outline for the talk, just I'll do a brief overview of the CFPB, but Jeff already went over that a little bit, so that is great. Our data journey, just like how our organization formed, where we kind of landed in the data boom. I'll go over like short history of the data, just like data space, how our tech platform formed as a new agency, and like how a new government agency gets up and running. How did our data organization evolve over time as the Bureau evolved over time, successes and challenges, lessons learned, and kind of like where we're currently at. And just mentioning any opinions or views stated by myself or my own and may not represent the Bureau's views. So we'll start with kind of the brief origin story of the CFPB. As Jeff mentioned, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is a 21st century agency of the US government that makes sure banks, lenders, and other financial institutions treat you fairly. CFPB was created and authorized to be created by the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Consumer Protection Act that passed in 2010 and was a response to the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. We have a very diverse and important mandate, in my opinion. So our mission work is very important. Some of that work includes at like a very high level, trying to root out unfair, deceptive, or abusive practices by writing rules, supervising companies, and enforcing the law. Trying to basically prevent folks from taking advantage of consumers. We take consumer complaints via consumer complaint intake system. We enforce laws that outlaw discrimination in consumer finance. We try to enhance financial education for consumers, try to share information that helps people make smarter financial decisions and not feel intimidated. For instance, any help that we could provide as tax season, everyone's favorite, I'm sure. Researching the consumer experience of using financial products, and we monitor financial markets for new risks to consumers, and we leverage data to the best of our abilities to do that. So a little bit about where we landed with, where did we land in the data boom when CFPB was formed? So the data space has been around for a long time. Some argue that as early as like 1962, that was modern day. It was predicted that modern day electronic computing on data analysis would become a empirical science, or just like a new function within the technology space. Data science as a official term was coined in 2001, and you could some folks argue that the modern data boom started in 2010, right around the time that CFPB was forming, which I think makes this important and interesting. So CFPB formally started operations in July 21st of 2011, so right in the midst of that boom. We started initially with a data team right off of the bat, which I think is very important. We made that commitment to data right off the bat, and that team continued to grow as the CFPB continued to grow. That helped affirm our commitment to data and data-driven decision-making. And that data space at that time wasn't like, it was defined, but like as it grew, was very fluid. So our platforms, our team kind of grew into that space as like new technologies were coming into the fold, as like new focuses were coming into the fold. And we built a data platform from the ground up, and as the space was growing, like that helped inform what we built. So how did our tech platform form as a new agency, and how does a government agency get up and running? So a thing to note is like CFPB was as close to a startup in the government as you can get. We're an independent agency, but how do we kind of get started right off the bat? We had an interim affiliation with the Department of the Treasury, and we leveraged some of their systems and like network, for instance, to kind of like be able to get up and running in lieu of like, we didn't have a lot in the beginning. We also, to kind of form our initial staff, we got some folks from the government into our agency from other agencies, and then also hired outside of the government as well. So it was a mix of government and non-government folks, or like maybe not previously government folks. So we had that interim affiliation with the Treasury from around 2011 to 2015. I think we tried to set up memorandums of understanding with different agencies to try to kind of like start really quickly doing some data sharing, like have something to build off of. It's also very just important to have relationships with other partner agencies throughout the government. So how did this kind of affect us building our platform, leveraging our data assets? Because I think the time at which we started with trying to use open source technologies in the different instances where that made sense. So when we're building that data platform from the ground up, like that was a focal point for us, and we weren't always able to use open source technologies, but we tried to when we could. We also tried to kind of be open around like open source sharing code where we could, and sharing stuff on our public website when those opportunities arise. But the trap that everyone, I feel like, falls into in like the startup world, or essentially everywhere. So we were a startup and agency. When do we want data? We wanted it now, or we wanted it yesterday. But you have to build a foundation before you can really reach. I don't know if folks are familiar with the data science hierarchy of needs pyramid, but we really wanted to reach the top as quickly as possible, which is artificial intelligence, deep learning, like deeper data analysis. But where we had to start was at the foundational layer of that pyramid, which is like building out our systems, cleaning data, being able to like have data flow from source to destination, structured, unstructured, like setting up those data pipelines, reaching that like next level of aggregation analysis, training data, moving on, like doing more simple ML algorithms, and then getting to the desired state of like having more of that AI ML capability. So as much as possible, and it happens everywhere, like we tried to jump to the top, and we kind of filled in the cracks in between like our foundation and getting to that AI space. So that foundational infrastructure, care and feeding, it's always a trap. But what do we focus on building early on? We needed a way to operate examinations. We needed, obviously, a data warehouse to kind of start centralizing our various data sources so we could blend data together, do some of that more interesting analysis. So in 2011, right, we were officially operating. In 2012, we needed to find a touch point to reach consumers. And in 2012, the first public release of the consumer complaint database was born. And that's a very important touch point for us at the Bureau, because it's our direct line to consumers, determining where we can, based on like the data that we get from that, we can occasionally track trends as to like things that might be happening out in the financial space, like how consumers might be harmed. So it's a very important asset and tool for us. And then from like 2014 onwards, like in between that, like our tooling kind of exploded. We were really trying to build out the data team at the Bureau was growing. So I mentioned that we started with the data team, but that data team in the beginning was very small. But it continued to grow over time as the Bureau grew and we got more folks on board. In 2014, we set up a self-service business intelligence platform to try to like get tooling out to the rest of the Bureau for like different analysts and just like staff folks who wanted to like needed data at their fingertips quickly. In 2015, between like 2015 and 2016, we really started building out our data platform, getting that data pipelining tooling going, setting up container orchestration, automation, just like hitting as many of those like crucial foundational pieces as we could. We also, like, another kind of interesting thing is like we focused on big data early on. So we were, I think in other organizations, like it maybe took a bit longer to get to that like ability to crunch through big data to have that capacity. And we just kind of were able to focus on that from the onset, I think just because of like where we started and where we landed in the data space. And then for like 2019 onwards, focusing on like cloud data strategy, like doing that deeper analysis. Like we have been doing that since the onset, but like having those, once we had all those platforms and tools in place, we were able to really start focusing on that like nitty gritty analysis, trying to like track trends in the marketplace, make sure that we're like trying to do regulation on like models that might be used, all of that fun good stuff. So that's a little bit about like how our tech platform evolved over time, and if anyone has any questions about that, we'll get to that piece later. But other interesting part is like, how did our data organization start, and then like how did that grow and evolve? So as I mentioned, we had a data team, but it was very small. I guess let me start by where we are at now, and then I'll kind of start from the beginning. So right now we live underneath the Office of the Chief Information Officer in the Office of Technology and Innovation. My section, the Enterprise Data and Analytics section, has 5 teams underneath of it. So we have data operations, which focuses on like, that's our admin arm for data management, essentially. They are kind of like the glue that kind of keeps us together. They focus a lot on helping like leverage operating our data sharing, like tiered support for our platform. We also have a data engineering team, which manages our data infrastructure, provides additional tooling on our platform, tries to make data access easier for different users throughout the Bureau. We have our data architecture team that focuses on like designing and optimizing systems, basically data of any size being nonetheless accessible to the fingertips of any user throughout the Bureau. Like that's one of their main focuses. So any level of expertise, like we try to make that available to folks. Our data science and analytics team, which has kind of like 3 programs underneath it. There's a legal analytics program, which focuses on supporting our like supervision and enforcement arm. We have our like artificial intelligence, like machine learning swim lane that really focuses on supporting the Bureau in that area very specifically, because that type of expertise is sorely needed. And we also have a digital analytics program, which focuses on our online experience, like how are consumers coming to us via our website, social media, any of the online presence pieces. And then we also have our business intelligence group, which focuses on like how does the Bureau operate most efficiently, provides a lot of that self-service tooling. As I mentioned, we had a self-service BI platform earlier on than I think in industry did, which has been very important. So they support folks throughout the Bureau they do training to make sure folks understand how to leverage our BI tools, all that fun stuff. So that's a longer than maybe needed, but overview of kind of like that is our current structure. And I will dig into a bit more about like how we support the Bureau as a central data organization. But where we started was three-ish people, I believe. So we had a data team, very small. And up until 2015, we were a very matrix team. We had roles, but we didn't really have sub teams underneath, right? So around 2015, we started to kind of like formalize. While we still like worked very matrix, we started to have those like data operations, data architecture, data science and analytics, business intelligence. Data engineering was an unofficial team up until last year, but the role was always there and considered separate. We also around 2015 started baking in data governance and policy into that data team and started kind of like building that out and formalizing those functions, as they are very crucial to our success and any organization's success around the like data, the use of data. And then you also might be wondering, like, what about the CDO, Chief Data Officer? We also got, I think, an earlier start to setting up a Chief Data Officer as well. As part of the Evidence-Based Policy Act of 2018, the Open Government Data Act designated a CDO was critically important. So that was out in 2018. We had our first CDO in November of 2014. And initially, our CDO office was underneath the CIO, and the data team, like the data management technology arm, that is essentially the version of my team today, was underneath that CDO, underneath the CIO. And so was the data governance, data policy, knowledge management. Around 2018, 2019, not sure exactly when, the CDO split out of the CIO office and is now at the same level of the CIO and the CDO. The data governance and policy knowledge management pieces of our data organization went to the Chief Data Office, and the data management technology arm stayed within the CIO to stay closer to the infrastructure, tools, and the rest of the technology organization. So we still work very closely together, obviously, because that's required and very important. So we still work very closely, but that also gives the CDO a bit more of a global reach to the rest of the Bureau, being at that broken out at the CIO level. So we had successes and challenges and lessons learned kind of as we grew. A big thing that I think everyone probably struggles with is like data is not synonymous to IT. We work in a different way. Becoming subject matter experts in data is pretty critical. It's critically important for our mission, and it takes a lot. It can take a lot of time depending on like the business unit you're working with, or like where that data reaches to, like how that data, just like understanding the various facets of our various data sets. Takes a lot of time and requires a lot of subject matter expertise. So like that understanding, I think generally is just like a hard nugget to crack and to kind of like get across to folks. Then that kind of blends into building out data literacy throughout organizations. And that's something that like we're building off of, and we're continuing to build up our data literacy and like our trainings and various programs throughout the Bureau. But like how did we excel, or like for my opinion, how did we excel at CFPB with data based on just kind of where we started, where we ended up? We were data driven from the start. Having like a data team at the onset, I think, is unique and pretty important, and was pretty crucial to our success. Like we made that commitment to data, and we're a data driven agency. We didn't have to fight to have the right equipment, which I think is something that that might seem like a small thing, but having a laptop with the right amount of memory in order to crunch through data locally and then push those things to production, etc. We were able to have MacBooks, for instance, which made our development lives a lot easier. Just the whole team, it made things a lot easier to for development, having access to tools, and just good equipment overall. And that equipment doesn't necessarily just translate to a laptop. We also had high performance hardware and platforms that help us to excel and crunch through data. I mentioned we got a head start, I think, on being able to process big data, knowing that was coming, getting buy-in on high performance hardware early on. So that was pretty crucially important. And I also mentioned that we're a central data team, so we support the Bureau centrally with distributed characteristics is kind of how I view it. For the business intelligence piece, we do have, I mentioned, we try to provide self-service tooling whenever possible, and there are analysts for operational analytics embedded throughout the Bureau, and we support those folks in a more distributed fashion as far as providing self-service tooling, training, but we also have folks that do central business intelligence development for. There might just be a situation where it's just too complex for a standard user to kind of have to go through and figure out how to, if you need to have managed groups and you have a large data set that could potentially involves PII, for example, that's something that we'll get more involved in and make sure that the security controls are in place. So I think we have a fairly good balance of how to manage that. We have a shared enterprise platform and tools. So that enterprise data platform is not just for the data team, it is for leverage it's to be leveraged throughout the whole Bureau. And there are various levels of data expertise throughout the Bureau. There's just folks who want to dabble. There's folks that have a need. There's different, for instance, the Office of Research, they have an environment that they work in, and there's they have their own environment, but then there's also the enterprise data platform tooling that they also leverage. So we have a fairly diverse tool set that folks can work on based on their understanding and level of expertise in different tools. Having that centralized support model gives us a shared understanding of governments, best practices surrounding Bureau data. And like I mentioned, that subject matter expertise in data is fairly important to understand the data and the mission that it serves. And that is not one of the things that we try to impress upon folks is that's not usually a short runway to getting to that point of understanding, especially when the data is intertwined with other data sets. That data ties to multiple different facets of our mission. There's a learning curve to some of that, and in some instances, it's a fairly easy, simple flat data set, which there are plenty of those. Also, something that we try to impress upon is depth and breadth for especially data scientists, data analysts, especially on the mission focused side of things, is pretty critically important to understand how different areas of the bureaus are interconnected. It helps to best inform work if they're working in more than one space, or at least understand more than one space within the different business units within the Bureau. And I think other places as well that would be true. Having a centralized data support also helps solve critical mass issues. Not having enough resources, by having a central pool to pull from, folks end up getting more diverse support. And also we have the infrastructure to support folks centrally, and we allow folks throughout the Bureau to leverage that, but having that understanding our data operations, data architecture, and data engineers are kind of our core support for our platforms, our tools, and kind of getting folks to providing those tools to the Bureau. And I already went through kind of mentioning our self-service model, which has been super important and a very successful program on our end. So I've just been talking about the how we excel, but there's also areas where like we could improve, and I think these are things that are pitfalls that like everyone falls in. Like we've all been, while CFPB was formed and like how that data journey grew is interesting, but we all grew into this space. Like even if it wasn't a startup, if existing agencies, other companies, like everyone has grown into this space in their own way. We spend a lot of time, like tech people end up doing non-tech work. We form like we need to form communication strategies as far as like we have these tools that you can leverage. We're here to help. Like here's what we do. So we end up spending some time to kind of like get that message across. It's not that that's not understood by different various aspects of the bureau, but like or when organizations reach a certain size, like there's an aspect of like marketing communications that's pretty important. And that just indicates that like we've grown, but we have these like different areas that are non-tech that we need to focus on as well. Kind of, I talked about that data literacy piece, but like pushing databases over flat files, like flat files aren't always the answer. Like we have these tools that like we can provide user-friendly views to that data, and like basically like databases aren't scary. Not thinking that everyone thinks databases are scary, but just like to the common user, getting across that like we can provide this in an easy digestible way, and the things on the back end you won't notice. There's also the challenge of kind of like getting over, like there's data literacy, so there's folks that know that they're not like as versed in data as the data subject matter expertise, and then there's also folks that think they understand data pretty well, and like some folks really do, and some folks like end up taking a view on something that isn't necessarily true. So part of our data literacy is just like getting folks to understand like the complexities of data, and like you can very quickly run, and for someone uninformed in a data set, for instance, could accidentally like provide data that maybe isn't wholly correct because they're looking at it from a view of someone who like doesn't do this every day. Trying to say that in short form. This is less is how we can improve, but also it's just like more data. Everyone wants more data. The more data that we have, the richer our data sets, the more that we're going to be able to do that artificial intelligence, the more that we're going to be able to impact our mission of like making sure we're following markets. If they are leveraging AI and different models, that we're able to replicate those and understand them. And that's something that is critically important to our work. Is there additional opportunities to get more data sets? Could we potentially procure to create data sets? We have a lot of, as I mentioned, we have a lot of relationships with different regulatory entities, and we have data sharing set up. We also procure various data sets as well from external to the Bureau. I think one of the big themes is like, is there more that we could do to focus on to kind of like create novel data sets that maybe don't exist in the space, because some of the data, some of the niche parts of the finance industry are fairly new. So like there might just be stuff that doesn't exist, and maybe that's an area that we could focus in on. And then the other just area that we could probably improve in is, I think it's something that like any growing organization has to deal with, is kind of just like folks I'm sure have heard the term of shadow IT, and battling, like as an organization grows, like people need things quickly, and they end up kind of like building out their own mini silos. So like we've ended up like supporting folks that like did that in the beginning, and we end up supporting those folks anyway. But it's just kind of making sure like it kind of ties back into that, letting folks know that we're here. That way, like they know that we're here to support them. They don't try to go find help that we already exist, or like other areas of an organization exist. So yeah, that's so Jeff, if you can hear me, I think that's the main meat and potatoes of the presentation. So if folks have any questions or anything that you want me to dig into more, be happy to answer.
Let me take the prerogative of asking the first question, then we have 6 or 8 that have already been posed by the audience. So the first question is, I wonder whether or not with artificial intelligence, I suspect you probably are ahead of a bunch of agencies, are you able to predict which organizations might be going to abuse consumers, or the other side, predict which consumers might be likely to be abused? And kind of be able to head it off at the pass to prevent the abuse. Are there initiatives or pilots like that CFPB has experimented with?
We're growing in that space, so we've always had I'd say we always had the capacity to kind of like do that artificial intelligence, but like also kind of, as I mentioned, like in the beginning, we didn't necessarily have like the data in order to do that type of analysis. For instance, like if you a lot of people try to jump to predictive analytics, let's say, but if you don't have like standardized data intakes, if you don't have like those rich data sets, like there's nothing to predict off of. So like there's different areas where like we have the right data and we're able to do that type of work, or like we have to kind of like build out the understanding that like, again, we can't reach the tip of that AI pyramid. We have to kind of like build out that data set underneath so that we can do that type of predictive analytics, that type of prioritization. Building out those models. So we do some of that work. We have run multiple pilots in that space, and it's only becoming more important because financial institutions are like growing. Like also like different institutions you have small banks that don't have a lot of technical capability, and then you have large banks that have like whole many armies of data folks that are able to kind of like grow their data chops in these various areas.
So maybe your advice kind of to other agencies that are perhaps especially in a regulatory environment is you need enough data on what's happened in the past to be able to predict it in the future. And so you perhaps ought to make your first order of business ensuring that you've got good, consistent data about past examples, in this case of abusive consumers. Let's see, Kathy Crowley asks, how big was your team when CFPB started, and how many now?
So I believe, and just a little background of where I started at the CFPB in 2014, and I worked there from 2014 to 2018, and then I took a 2-year hiatus at a company called Leafly, and then I came back in August of 2020. So I've been back for is that eight-ish months. But I'm working on the same team that I was on before. Now I'm just like in a more leadership capacity than I was from the offset. So I've asked some folks, for folks that were here from like the 2011 days, I went on some history fact-finding missions before this talk. So it sounds like we started off with like three-ish people, so like very small. Also, the Bureau started off like fairly at a smaller scale, and it took a while to kind of ramp up. That team of federal folks is now around 20 people. But we also have contractors that help us to like operate certain tools and projects. So hopefully that helps.
Okay. And these are great questions, so I'm just going to read them kind of as they came in. I hope I don't mispronounce names, but Martha Hinnon asks, what data tools did you identify and are you using for automated data access, wrangling, cleaning, etc.?
So we're actually in the midst of, we're going through a cloud migration right now. So our platform started on-prem, and now we're migrating to the cloud. So there's a lot more, there's different tools that are more available, and like a lot of different folks within the industry are taking advantage of like the ability to be elastic and scale that the cloud gives you that you don't necessarily have on-prem, or you have that, but you have to like really pre-plan that, as you have to buy hardware in order to be able to scale into, rather like you can just have that at will within a cloud space. So we're looking at different data warehouse solutions right now. There's different like data wrangling and data pipelining tools that are like new that we're currently evaluating. Like Airflow is a common one that a lot of folks know of who like just play around in the data space. And there's the different like big data cloud data warehouses like Redshift and Snowflake that have grown in industry. So I know that isn't terribly specific, but we're actually going through an interesting exercise where we're like changing around some of our tooling because more is now like unlocked within the cloud space.
I wonder, this is kind of going out on a limb, but if you're willing to disclose and we were able to share it then back with the audience, is there kind of a 1 or a 2-page summary of your data architecture or your data tool set that could be publicly shared?
Let me go back to the folks within our ethics office to see if that's something that I could share. I would love to if I'm able to.
If that turns out to be possible, I'll make a commitment that if Shannon, you can get it to me, I can get it to everybody who's participating in this event. Some of you may be interested, some not. Let's see, Guled Hersey asks, does your agency have data pipelines connected to other regulatory agencies such as FINRA, SEC? And would you say that you adopt open source and new technology quicker than other agencies with legacy systems and different security challenges?
So we do get data from the other regulatory agencies, and we have various ways that we do get data from those folks. Some are more automated, some are like less automated just by the tools that are available that like the different regulatory agencies use. I think definitely like the data sharing space between like regulatory agencies and other agencies are going to mature like now that there's like vast new platforms to leverage to like be able to share data from external to internal. Snowflake, for example, if another agency or like company, for instance, that you wanted to share data with, like it has like native data sharing capabilities, and just more platforms and tools are, I think, trying to make that easier because it can be hard and it can be messy depending on the data that you're looking at.
Yeah.
There was another aspect. Can you repeat that question? There's a piece.
My read of it was asking is, are you faster and better than other agencies? I'm not sure that was really the intent, but the specifics were, would you say your agency can adopt open source or new technology quicker than other agencies? What might be interesting is to say, perhaps if you are able to adopt quicker or experiment more easily, are there any ways that you kind of either got that authority or have taken advantage of that other agencies could learn from?
I think so definitely like in the beginning, I mean, there were not a lot of people. We didn't have there wasn't a lot of process and framework in place. Like while there was, like we had a lot of latitude to kind of like pick technologies and tools. So like we definitely, I think we're more open source than other agencies are just by the nature of like the time that we formed. We didn't have a lot of legacy. We didn't have any legacy systems to essentially like have to migrate off of, for instance. So like we started from the ground up, and we started from the ground up using like new tools in this space, which made it a lot easier. So I think from that perspective, like we had a big leg up for sure. And that's just like from like a technology and innovation organization, like that's where we started and where we wanted to go. Like we wanted to leverage open source where it was available, but then like, again, like in some instances you can't, in which case like we'd go to like COTS products. But I think that's what gave us like the early leg up, is just like us being a 21st century agency, like our mindset was just framed. Now we've ended up having to do our, so this is more of a CRM system, but our consumer complaint system, the way we intake complaints, and some folks are familiar with the consumer complaint database, which we share publicly. That system was originally like Oracle right now was a CRM that we used. And I think around 2014 or 2015, we migrated to our new, it's called Mosaic, our new consumer complaint intake system, which is Salesforce oriented. So that was the first probably major legacy system that we migrated to. And that was a lot of data, and that was probably the most painful project that I've worked on. It was successful, but like that was a lot of, that was the first time I think that we had to just like go through that like a big effort of like migrating from a legacy platform to a new platform, migrating all of the data associated with it, because obviously you can't lose anything. So I don't know if hopefully that's helpful, but like just having that open source mindset and being a young agency, like around the 2010 period, like really gave us a leg up in using these new tools and technologies, I think.
So Karen Liang has two questions, both of which I find really interesting. The first is kind of what you might traditionally ask the Silicon Valley folks, fail fast. Her question is, what has been your agency's most educational mistake? Again, something maybe that you would say, hey, we tried this, don't do this at your agency because we've already learned this lesson.
I don't know if I can necessarily dive into specifics, but I think we have run into issues where we did fail fast, and I think in other instances where we failed slower. And I think we learned a lot from failing slow, that it has helped us to be able to like do that any faster. Like we picked a tool, for instance, that I think it was just folks want tools, right? And they'll end up pushing for those tools, whether they're like maybe the right decision or not. So I think we've learned a lot about like trying to adopt systems and not being able to do that, and just kind of like learning more about like communicating out to folks who aren't technical around like these are I guess what I'm getting at partially is sometimes you'll run into the situation where a customer is trying to kind of like serve you up a solution at the beginning. It's not like, this is my problem, this is my requirements, like I need this thing. It's like, I would like you to procure this software, please. And we're like, whoa. We already have a platform that does that, or we have people, for instance, that, so like data, for instance, is kind of like a particularly hard job, like roles that are hard for people to kind of wrap their minds around. So for instance, like rather than procuring a tool to do a data ingest, like we have someone who could write a data pipeline in like 10 minutes if it's like very simple. But like there's a misconception within industry, I think everywhere, that like you need platforms to do this, where like you maybe have people and resources to do this. There's a level of, there's the split between, do you do custom development for a thing or do you not do custom development for a thing? And like, I think a lot of folks think custom development, especially in like the data space, is going to be very onerous, where we have like these frameworks already set up in place that like we can do that very simply. And like we ingest from various sources, and we have like automated pipelines, and we're doing that daily, hourly. So
Okay.
I think I deviate a bit from question, but hopefully
No
that's
insightful. So Karen had a completely different second question, which is, can you talk about any success or challenge in tracking outcomes by race/ethnicity?
What I can say is that like for folks who might be kind of like tracking recent CFPB, there's been a huge push by our current acting director to focus on racial equity, diversity, and to focus on the pandemic. And so focusing on racial equity as like a whole, but then also the pandemic, and making sure and looking at the pandemic with a lens of like racial equity. So I think we have had, and that's a really hard space, especially within artificial intelligence. There's the whole like fair lending aspect to it. There's that you have to look for and account for bias within your models. And it's a very tricky space to be in. So it's something that we've been particularly focusing on. And it's huge and it's challenging, and yeah, that's probably all I can say about that. But it's something that's really, really come into focus, especially in the new administration.
Mm-hmm. Gregory White has a question. Any recommendations on ramping up the skill set of those who are interested in analytics and data, but maybe don't have the current appropriate skills, especially if the overall picture in-house at an agency is no one really has the skills?
There's tons of great, I think, like free content out there to kind of like build out those skill sets. So like if that's something that folks were interested in, like I could provide a list of kind of like open source training materials where like there's just a huge depth and breadth of information out there, where like you can teach yourself you can teach yourself a lot. There's also I know one of the big things at the company that I came from, like my hiatus from CFPB is what I've been calling it. There's, I mean, outside of just like the free material that's out there, and just like also tooling, so like AWS cloud, right? Like there's the free tier where you could do a lot, like if you wanted to kind of like do like those free training or courses, you can leverage that free tier within AWS to kind of like play around in the sandbox, for instance. There's also boot camps where, I mean, that's a paid thing, but like my last company like took a lot of folks from boot camp, so you didn't necessarily have to have a 4-year degree per se to work at different companies within the government. I don't think that's as widely accepted, but like within outside of government, I think that's more acceptable or becoming a more acceptable practice and educational avenue.
I feel I do have to put in a plug for our partner, which is Johns Hopkins University actually does offer not only classes, but certificates and degrees in data analytics, and they're focused not entirely, but significantly on government. And in many cases, actually, I think a significant portion of their folks are government employees who are full-time government employees who are taking courses in evenings and occasionally weekends. So there's also an option there.
Yes.
Guled Hersey has, I think, a fantastic question, which is, do you have, and I'm not sure what Kaggle style is, do you have Kaggle style data sets or some portal where a citizen can come and play with data sets? And then to a certain extent, do you capture any value back by getting ideas or insights from what those external players find as they play?
So we do have different ways to, so we do share data externally. So you can go on the website and kind of see the data that you can download. And I know that like there like are like different colleges and universities. There's like college students that have like taken that data and like used it and like I think published research around CFPB data that's like free and open to the public. So that's definitely available. We've also been kicking off tech sprints within the Bureau, which are external to us, which are focused in different specific avenues. So like that does engage with folks external to CFPB and focuses on various areas. So that's one way that we try to get like opinion out there. And there's also like things that I think get like built out as part of those tech sprints that like then help like inform us also like what getting ideas outside of ourselves I think is really important. So those tech sprints have been really insightful and they're newer, so it's like a new tool that we've been able to kind of get out there, get different opinions. Yeah.
Great. My colleague Andy Zeswitz, REI's CTO, says many agencies have some policies around data that allows or dictates allowable use, and essentially kind of, you know, the way agencies have always used the data is the way it's supposed to be used. Occasionally there are restrictions on new or innovative uses that kind of maybe either slow them or prevent them. Do you find this is a problem at all at CFPB? Does it restrict innovation? How do you deal with that to kind of let people create new uses, especially as you say you're democratizing the kind of anybody at CFPB can use the data? How do you kind of balance protecting against misuse with encouraging innovation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our folks within our chief data office do a great job of setting up like those data privacy, data governance. So like they help kind of build in those controls. And then as the data management tech arm, we help kind of enforce those restrictions. So we do have data sets that, for instance, have PII. So like there's we follow in large part a policy of least privilege. So like use what you need, and then like if you need an additional layer, like that's something that you can request access to. So I think we do a pretty good job of like making data available to folks who need it for sure. I think the biggest area of restriction that I see is kind of within the government. I think particularly like social media data is a tough one, just because like even though that data is like like open to the public, that's not something that we can just intake and use at will. So there's a lot of guardrails that we have to like build around that. We have to kind of like look at that in aggregate. So that's that would be like the greatest restriction that I think I've encountered. But we do, so we have that self-service tooling, so we've built governance around those things as well. So there's the difference between like someone like you have a desktop tool and like you have availability to certain data sets, and anything that's kind of like doesn't have PII, like as folks request access, is generally available, but we have built in like different levels of permission within certain data sets where like there is more PII information, and like that level of access that you get is based on your need.
Yeah, and let's make this the final question. This one actually is mine, which is, how do you decide when to buy outside data, how much to spend on it? And you know, if you can share it, do you have an annual budget for buying data from outside the agency?
I don't have a budget I can share, but like I think when it's all mission focused, right? So if we need something that we don't have that would be crucial to the success of our mission, protecting consumers, like that's something that we look into. So we do purchase data outside of the government currently, and I think there's room where we could look at additional. And again, I kind of mentioned one of that like more interesting ways to think about that is like, what doesn't exist in this space, and is there something that we could potentially procure or create that is like net new but like is super impactful? And like having that ability to do that like takes a lot of space and time to kind of like come up with that and figure out like if there's new ways to blend data sets or like a new way to craft that. But also like we have to be very careful around like that PII piece as well. Always is something that we're very careful of.
Great. I want to give you my thanks. This has been really interesting, Shannon. We appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts. Those couple of items, if you're able to share and release them to us, then we can certainly distribute them to all of the attendees. And Jen, do you want to have any closing remarks?
Yes, I just wanted to say thank you as well, Shannon, for a truly excellent presentation and your valuable insights. And I also want to thank our audience for attending and participating today. Again, a recording of the event will be posted shortly, and we very much hope to see you at a future event. And I hope everyone has a wonderful holiday weekend.
Thank you both. This was great. Thanks everyone for taking the time to listen to me talk.
Thank you all.